Got back from a trip. The shower was running. I pulled the curtain back. My fiancée wasn't alone. I let them finish while I packed her things. The client meeting was supposed to run until Friday. That was the only reason I agreed to take the flight out of the country in the first place. A week away, long hours, business dinners, and no distractions. But on Wednesday morning, a sudden cancellation hit my inbox. I booked an earlier return without mentioning it to anyone, not even Tessa. When I unlocked the apartment door, the air felt thick and humid, like someone had just stepped out of a sauna. I didn't hear the usual TV chatter or the soft click of her laptop keys. Instead, there was the low, steady hiss of running water from the bathroom. At first, I didn't think much of it. Tessa liked long showers after her morning runs. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something that made my gut twist. Two distinct shadows moving behind the frosted glass shower screen. I pulled the curtain back in one smooth motion. Tessa's head snapped toward me, eyes wide. Beside her stood a man I'd never seen before. Tall, lean, tattoos curling down one arm. Steam clung to their skin. Both of them caught mid-reach for the same bottle of shampoo, like they'd been doing this for a while. Neither of them said a word. I didn't either. I let the moment hang in the thick, wet air before turning away. I walked straight to the bedroom, yanked her suitcases from the closet, and started filling them with her clothes. By the time they'd shut the water off, I had her shoes, toiletries, and a pile of mail stuffed into the side pocket. The man left without making eye contact. Tessa trailed after him, dripping onto the carpet, muttering something I didn't bother to process. When I rolled the suitcases to the front door, she finally raised her voice. I ignored it. The click of the lock behind her was louder than anything she'd said. That should have been the end. Pack up her things, delete her number, and get on with my life. But it didn't feel clean. The man was a stranger, but there had been something in his eyes. Not guilt, not even arrogance. More like recognition. The way someone looks at you when they've seen your face before, but can't quite place it. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, thinking about how easily I could just block her and walk away. My phone buzzed with 3 missed calls from her overnight, each paired with a text that started off defensive and slid into pleading. None of them explained who he was. That's when I noticed the crumpled receipt on the floor near the coat rack. I hadn't seen it before. It was from a storage facility in Brookside, about 20 minutes outside the city. Paid in cash. Dated just last week. The name on the receipt was hers, but the handwriting scrawled in the signature line didn't quite match the way she usually signed anything. I could have tossed it, but something about the cash payment and the way it had been half hidden under a pair of her old running shoes felt wrong. If she'd wanted to hide an affair, a storage unit was an odd place to start. I drove out to Brookside that afternoon. The facility was one of those long rows of metal roll-up doors, each with a number stenciled above it. The office was staffed by a guy in his late 20s with earbuds in. I handed him the receipt and asked if the unit was still active. He glanced at the paper, tapped something into his computer, and said the payment was good through the end of the month. Then he asked if I wanted to add my name to the list of authorized visitors. That stopped me. I hadn't said I was her fiancé, hadn't shown ID, nothing. For him to offer that meant either the rules here were lax or she'd given some kind of blanket permission that didn't care who showed up as long as they knew the number. I told him no, I was just checking on the payment. He shrugged and went back to whatever was on his phone. Driving away, I kept replaying the image of that guy in the shower. The tattoos, the confident way he stood there even after being caught. He didn't seem like someone worried about me, which meant he either thought I wouldn't do anything or he had something bigger to lose than just a woman. That night, I decided to check the building's security footage. The super had a small office off the lobby, walls lined with monitors. I told him I thought I'd lost a package and wanted to see if anyone had picked it up by mistake. He didn't mind letting me scroll through the past week. There he was, the same guy from the shower, coming in at 9:42 p.m. 3 nights in a row. Each time, Tessa met him in the lobby and they went upstairs together. No disguises, no hesitation. On 2 of those nights, he left alone around midnight. But on the 3rd, they both left carrying 2 large shopping bags each. Something about that set off a different kind of alarm. Tessa wasn't a shopper. She hated malls. And whatever was in those bags wasn't clothing. The way they carried them, stiff and careful, was more like moving fragile equipment than new shoes. The thought crossed my mind that maybe this was more than a personal betrayal. Maybe I'd been living with someone involved in something she didn't want me to see. The next morning, I dug through the drawers in our bedroom. In the back of her nightstand, behind a stack of old birthday cards, was a tablet I hadn't seen before. It was logged into a Gmail account that didn't use her name. I told myself I wouldn't snoop, but the curiosity won. The inbox was filled with payment confirmations from online marketplaces I didn't recognize. Most of them were for high-end electronics, drones, gaming laptops, studio cameras, all marked as shipped to various addresses across the state. None of them matched ours. There were also long threads with usernames instead of names. The tone was cold, businesslike. Phrases like final batch and meeting spot confirmed jumped out at me. And then there was a folder of photos, hundreds of images of boxed merchandise stacked in what looked like a storage unit. It didn't take much to connect the dots. The man from the shower wasn't just some fling. He was part of whatever side hustle she'd been running. The storage unit receipt was the breadcrumb I wasn't supposed to find. That evening, I called Patrick, an old friend from my army days who now worked private security for a shipping company. I gave him the partial license plate I'd spotted in the lobby footage and asked if he could run it through his contacts. He said he'd get back to me in a few days. 2 hours later, he called back. The car was registered to a Colin Mercer. No criminal record, but several flagged incident reports as a person of interest in theft investigations. Nothing pinned on him yet, but enough for Patrick to tell me to be careful. I sat in the dark living room, staring at the storage unit receipt on the coffee table. This wasn't just infidelity. This was organized, deliberate, and possibly dangerous. And I'd walked right into it without realizing the depth of it until now. The problem was, if I moved too fast, I'd tip them off. If I waited too long, they could clear out whatever was in that unit and disappear. The decision came quietly, the way a lock clicks into place. I wasn't going to confront her about the shower, the bags, or the tablet. I'd act like she no longer existed in my life, while pulling at the threads until the whole thing came apart in my hands. And the first thread was sitting 20 minutes away in a row of metal doors in Brookside. The next morning, I drove back to Brookside. This time I didn't just plan to check the payment. I wanted to see what was behind that door. I wasn't on the authorized list, but I had a plan, not the kind you run past a lawyer, but the kind you develop in the Army when you need information without anyone knowing you were there. I parked 3 blocks away, waited until the office clerk stepped outside for a smoke, and walked straight down the row of units until I found hers, 314B. The padlock wasn't heavy duty. I'd brought a small set of picks I kept for camping lockboxes. It took less than a minute. The metal door rattled upward, the sound echoing in the long corridor. Inside was nothing like what I expected. It wasn't a messy pile of personal junk. It was clean, organized, more like a small-scale warehouse. Stacks of sealed boxes lined both walls. Most had brand names stamped across the sides: Apple, Sony, DJI. Every box was pristine, factory tape intact. But the real surprise was toward the back. Against the far wall stood a metal shelving unit with 5 large handbags sitting in clear dust covers. Not just any handbags: Hermes, Chanel, Dior. Each worth thousands. And next to them, an open laptop humming quietly on a folding table, screen glowing with a Gmail login page. The name at the top wasn't Tess's. It wasn't even close. The inbox was full of ongoing threads about deliverables and client satisfaction. Attached were spreadsheets listing serial numbers, model IDs, and delivery addresses. Some of the addresses matched the ones I'd seen on her hidden tablet. I scrolled further down and found something that made my stomach knot. An email chain between this account and someone calling themselves badge_9. The messages were encrypted looking at first, but then I realized it was just deliberate shorthand and code. Lines like B9 clear and unit sweep 0 stood out. Then there were payment confirmations, direct transfers from anonymous accounts, each in the thousands. This wasn't random side hustling. This was organized theft, possibly coordinated with someone inside law enforcement. I stepped back, took out my phone, and shot quick photos of everything. The boxes, the bags, the laptop screen, the shelving unit. I kept my gloves on the whole time. Before leaving, I relocked the unit exactly as I'd found it. Driving home, I kept thinking about Colin's eyes that day in the shower. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. The kind of look someone gives when they're deciding if you're a threat to their operation. That night, Patrick called. He dug deeper on Colin. Aside from the flagged incident reports, there were rumors, nothing that made it to official files, about him acting as a middleman for stolen tech. The kind of guy who didn't do the actual lifting, but knew how to move merchandise without it touching his name. Ryan, Patrick said. If she's with him, she's not just cheating. She's in it up to her neck. And if there's a cop in the mix, you can't go to the local precinct. That'll tip them off. The next morning, I decided to test something. I sent Tessa a short, vague text. Need to talk about the Brookside thing. No other details. Within 5 minutes, she called, first sounding casual, then sharp when I didn't pick up. Over the next hour, I got 3 more texts, each less patient than the last. She never mentioned the storage unit outright, but the urgency in her tone was enough confirmation for me. Patrick and I agreed on a plan. He'd tap one of his off-duty contacts in a neighboring county, someone not tied to the city's chain of command, to quietly check the plate numbers I gathered from the storage facility's parking lot cameras. He also wanted me to pull more data from the laptop in the unit, which meant going back in. 2 nights later, I returned. I timed it for the last 20 minutes before the facility closed, when most tenants had already cleared out. This time, I plugged a small thumb drive into the laptop and copied everything: emails, spreadsheets, contact lists. It took almost the whole 20 minutes, but before I left, I spotted one more detail. On the inside wall of the unit, taped above the folding table, was a printed itinerary. 2 names, 2 flight numbers, a departure date just 3 days away. Destination, Montreal. I didn't need to guess who the 2 passengers were. Tessa and Colin weren't just running this operation here. They were about to leave. And if Montreal was the real destination, there was a good chance they weren't planning to come back. The thumb drive's contents were worse than I thought. Patrick called me the next day after going through the files. There were not just sales records but also lists of items that had been flagged, stolen from police evidence rooms, seized during unrelated investigations, then never logged back in. Whoever badge_9 was, they were pulling these items out and funneling them straight into Tessa and Colin's hands. Patrick's contact in the neighboring county confirmed something else. Badge_9 matched the login code for a Sergeant Miller in our city's property crimes division. No prior discipline on file, but now his name was directly tied to transactions for stolen property. We were now in dangerous territory. Patrick wanted to hand it over to his friend in state police right away, but I suggested we wait. If Tessa and Colin left for Montreal, they might take the rest of the evidence with them. Or worse, Miller could catch wind of the investigation and disappear. So we decided on a middle ground. We'd keep collecting until the day before their flight, then turn it all over to the state police in one package. That way, they could hit all 3 at once: storage unit, apartment, and airport. I played my part by keeping silent. I didn't answer Tessa's calls, didn't block her, just let the unanswered messages pile up. The less she knew about my movements, the better. But I wanted to rattle her just enough to make her rush. So 2 days before the planned sting, I sent her one more message: "Hope Montreal works out for you." It was like lighting a fuse. Within an hour, she'd left me a voicemail, half snarling, half panicked, demanding to know who I'd been talking to. She said nothing about Colin or the storage unit, just circled around phrases like private matters and none of your business. Later that night, Patrick called with another update. His contact had spotted Colin's car outside a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The warehouse was owned by a shell company linked to Miller. We didn't have the legal grounds to enter, but the implication was clear. The operation was bigger than just one storage unit. I went to bed that night knowing the clock was ticking faster now. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how far Tessa had fallen from the person I thought I'd been with. The affair almost felt like background noise compared to the fact she'd been living a double life. One that involved stolen property, a corrupt cop, and plans to skip the country. The next morning, I drove past the Brookside facility one last time before the sting. I half expected the unit to be empty already, but it was still locked, still quiet. I didn't stop. I didn't want my face anywhere near it on the final day. Patrick had arranged everything. Tomorrow, the state police would be waiting at the airport while a separate team hit the storage unit and the warehouse. If it worked, all 3 would be caught in the same 24-hour window. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered without thinking. "Ryan." A male voice said, low and even. "You need to stop looking into things that don't concern you." I didn't speak. The silence stretched. "You think you're clever," the voice went on, "but you're not the only one watching." The line went dead. I sat there in the car, hands still on the wheel, and realized the game had just shifted again. Someone knew I was digging, and they were close enough to reach out directly. And tomorrow, if one thing went wrong, I might not just be ending an engagement. I might be putting myself on the wrong side of the people who'd built this entire operation. The anonymous call from the night before hadn't been a bluff. If someone had my number and the nerve to warn me off, it meant my presence in this mess was no longer incidental. I was officially on their radar. Patrick didn't waste time. The morning became a rush of encrypted calls between him and the state police contact, who confirmed the sting would still happen, but with the timeline moved up. They cut the window by a full day. If word had leaked, every hour we waited increased the chance that Colin, Tessa, and Sergeant Miller would clear everything out and vanish. The original plan was straightforward: arrest the 2 passengers at the airport, hit the storage unit and the warehouse at the same time. But when you compress a plan into a third of the intended time, simple turns into improvised. By midday, Patrick called again, his voice tight. Colin's car had been seen outside Tessa's apartment building. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near there. The assumption had been they'd be laying low until their flight. That change in behavior meant they were either moving something early or checking if I'd backed off. Patrick told me to tail them if they left, keeping my distance. About 20 minutes later, Colin walked out carrying a large duffel bag, Tessa right behind with a smaller one. They loaded the trunk and drove off. I followed 4 cars back until they pulled into the industrial district, straight to the warehouse Patrick's contact had flagged. The gates were open, 2 men loading crates into a panel van. I parked down the block, camera ready. Colin and Tessa took their bags inside and stayed for about 15 minutes before returning empty-handed. I sent the photos to Patrick, who passed them to the state police. The timetable shrank again. The police moved in immediately. 2 teams went out, one for the warehouse, one for the storage unit. The airport arrest would have to wait. If Colin and Tessa got spooked here, they'd never show at the gate. Watching the warehouse, I expected the unmarked SUVs to roll up quietly. Instead, a black sedan pulled in first. From the passenger side stepped Sergeant Miller. If he saw law enforcement coming, he'd bolt or tip off the others. I told Patrick. His reply was short, "We move now." The takedown was quick, but messy. The state police team hit the side entrance, but one of the loaders spotted them and yelled. In the scramble, Miller ran for the back door and straight into an officer covering the perimeter. Inside, Colin and one warehouse guy were caught trying to pry open a crate. The duffel Tessa had carried and sat on the floor, filled with smaller boxes of watches, phones, and jewelry. Tessa wasn't there. I scanned the street, but she had slipped out before the raid started. No one saw her leave, which meant she'd used another exit. I guess where she'd gone. The storage unit. If she'd been warned, she might try to clear it before the police arrived, or destroy whatever linked her to Miller directly. I drove to Brookside and saw her car. The door to 314B was halfway up. Tessa was inside, pulling boxes off shelves and tossing them into her open trunk. She froze when she saw me, then straightened, eyes flicking to the padlock dangling from the latch. She spat words heavy with venom, but I didn't bother engaging. I stepped inside, blocking the exit. The laptop was gone. The handbags were gone. She noticed me notice. She told me I didn't understand what I'd stepped into, that this wasn't about me, that I was already dead if I kept going. I told her the police were on the way, and that leaving now would only make her look worse later. For a moment she calculated, then bolted for her car. I let her go. Every move she made now was another nail in her own case. Minutes later, the state police team arrived. I gave them the partial inventory still on the shelves and told them what she'd taken. Colin and Miller were already in custody. They just needed her. They picked her up 2 miles away, still in possession of the handbags and a backpack full of documents tying her to both the warehouse and Miller's transfers. Patrick called as they loaded her into the back of an SUV, telling me I'd just saved them weeks of paperwork. But I knew better. People like Miller don't talk unless they have to, and people like Tessa only talk when it suits them. There would be fallout, the kind that doesn't make the news. And from the look she gave me through the tinted glass, I knew she wasn't done playing. Tessa's arrest at the storage unit should have been the end of it, but the next 48 hours made it clear that endings in situations like this are never clean. That night, Patrick's contact from state police called to say all 3, Tessa, Colin, and Sergeant Miller, were booked. The warehouse was sealed, the storage unit locked as evidence, and the seized inventory was already being cataloged. On paper, it looked airtight. The first cracks showed the following morning when my phone lit up with a string of messages from unknown numbers. Some were threats, short, crude warnings to keep quiet or drop the statements. Others were stranger, almost polite reminders that testifying can be dangerous. Patrick told me to forward everything to the state police, but his tone carried the unspoken truth. People connected to Miller's network might not care that their guy was behind bars. By midday, the story had hit the local news, not because of Tessa, but because of Miller's name. A decorated sergeant from property crimes charged with conspiracy, theft, and abuse of authority was worth headlines. They ran his booking photo alongside a blurred image of Colin being led from the warehouse. The report barely mentioned a female associate, but it was enough for mutual acquaintances to connect the dots. I woke up the next day to find my social media quietly flooded with speculation. That afternoon, a mutual friend sent me screenshots from Tessa's personal accounts. In the comments, she was painting herself as a victim, claiming she'd been manipulated, that Colin and Miller had used her, that she'd been unwittingly drawn in. She left out the part about the stolen handbags and the backpack full of documents in her car when she was caught. Patrick told me not to engage, but I knew that if she controlled the narrative among our shared circles, it wouldn't just be about gossip. It could affect how the prosecutors handled her cooperation. I still had the photos I'd taken in the storage unit before the raids. I sent them to Patrick's contact, who promised they'd go into the official case file. Once that evidence became part of discovery, her "I didn't know" defense would look ridiculous. A week later, I was called in to give a formal statement. The prosecutors didn't just want my account of the storage unit and the warehouse. They wanted everything from the first moment I suspected something was off. They pressed on the anonymous call, the text responses when I mentioned Brookside, and even the detail about the way she and Colin carried those shopping bags out of my building. They were building a timeline, and every detail helped link her to Miller's pipeline of stolen goods. Colin cracked first. Faced with a list of charges long enough to ruin him, he flipped on Miller in exchange for a reduced sentence. That left Tessa as the last piece they needed to tie everything together. When they confronted her with the emails, the serial number logs, and Colin's testimony, she folded, but only halfway. She admitted to helping move certain items, but insisted she never knew they were stolen from evidence rooms. It was a transparent attempt to keep her sentence light without fully cooperating. The trial date for Miller was set, but Tessa's case moved faster because she was willing to plead. She took a deal: 18 months in county jail and 3 years probation. The handbags, the laptop, and everything in the storage unit were forfeited as evidence. Colin was looking at 5 years in state prison. Miller's charges carried the possibility of more than a decade. When the sentences were made public, any remaining sympathy for Tessa evaporated. Her parents, who had avoided speaking to me since the breakup, quietly reached out, not to apologize, but to ask if I could help recover some of her personal property that hadn't been seized. I told them it had all been turned over to law enforcement, which was true, and that I wanted no further involvement, which was also true. Even after the legal dust began to settle, I stayed careful. I changed my number, moved to a different apartment, and made sure the new address wasn't connected to any of my old accounts. Patrick warned me that networks like Miller's sometimes had loose ends, and while most of them would move on, it was better not to be easy to find. Months later, a news article confirmed Miller's conviction on all counts. Colin's sentencing was final, and Tessa had been moved to a minimum security facility. I read it once, closed the tab, and left it at that. Looking back, the day I pulled the shower curtain back wasn't the day I caught my fiancée cheating. It was the day I stepped onto a trail that led straight into the middle of a criminal operation. If I'd just thrown her out and walked away, she'd probably be in Montreal right now, running the same play with someone else. Instead, she ended up right where she belonged, and I walked away with more than closure. I walked away knowing that some endings aren't about revenge or forgiveness. They're about removing yourself completely from the world that person lives in and making sure they can't pull you back.
Analogy, and if, you were having a birthday party or whatever for your kid and you say, come on over, I'd be like, all right, cool, but there's a peanut allergy going on. They're like, oh, no worries, because everyone knows a child could die. All right, thankfully ours doesn't have a anaphylactic, but that can happen, right? But if this kid comes over to your house and they accidentally, you've made a sandwich that had some peanut butter on it that morning, that's enough peanut to give a kid an anaphylactic shock so intense they'll stop breathing. And you're not about to say, hey, Jimmy, can you start breathing again? Can you unconstrict your throat muscles, please? Can you stop asphyxiating, please? They cannot stop the allergic reaction.